Welcome to the Captains of History podcast. In today's episode, Julius Caesar meets the Queen of Egypt. Queen of Egypt. Victory over Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus cemented Caesar's position as the most preeminent individual in the Roman world. Although he was a titan beyond compare amongst his peers, there remained many unwilling to submit themselves to his king-like authority. Headed by the indefatigable Cato and the immensely aristocratic Metellus Scipio, the senatorial cause lived on in Africa. In time, Caesar would be forced to continue the war in a new continent and finally snuff out the embers of resistance. But before he could accomplish this, he put himself to the task of reorganizing and pacifying the incredibly ancient land of Egypt, ruled by the god kings and queens of the House of Ptolemy from the city of Alexandria. Egypt was a land incalculably ancient, mysterious, and sinister to the Romans. Its people worshipped gods with the heads of animals, and its history stretched back far into the mists of time. The current dynasty, the Ptolemies, were descended from a general and rumoured half-brother of the great Macedonian king Alexander, and they had ruled in Egypt for over 2 centuries, but were comparative barbarians to the archaic civilization they governed. To the Romans, this link to Alexander the Great, whom they hero-worshipped, was fascinating. So too was the immense wealth of Egypt, which was so vast that its sheer size had prevented any greedy Roman from conquering and claiming it. For no other Roman could countenance this wealth falling into the hands of a rival. Over the years, Crassus, Clodius, and Caesar had all schemed for this end to no avail. Beyond its wealth and its antiquity, Egypt represented to the Romans everything wrong and corrupted about the East and its autocratic kings. Corrupt, decadent, feminine, and weak, the people of its capital, the largest and most grandiose city in the Mediterranean, Alexandria, were prone to constant riots and were known to rip unpopular monarchs limb from limb. Into this cauldron, following his stunning victory at Pharsalus, sailed Caesar. In typical Ptolemaic Egyptian fashion, Pompey and Caesar both arrived at a kingdom at war with itself. The boy king Ptolemy XIII was engaged in a bitter struggle with his older half-sister, Cleopatra. As well as being the boy's sister, she was also his wife, and Queen of Egypt in her own right. The incest of the Ptolemies was infamous in Rome, and was used to paint the pharaohs of Egypt as degenerate barbarians. Incest was an ancient custom of the native Egyptian pharaohs, which the Macedonian dynasty of Ptolemy had taken up with gusto. In fact, the Ptolemaic family penchant for incest was only bested by their love of murdering one another. The royal couple's father, King Ptolemy XII Auletes, had murdered his own daughter, Berenice, when she had usurped the throne from him. When Caesar arrived, he decided to arbitrate between the warring factions and make peace in the kingdom. He brought only 4,000 men, as he initially had no intention of remaining in Egypt, occupying the enormous royal enclosure, which covered a third of the whole city. He summoned King Ptolemy and Queen Cleopatra to him to make a judgment on the conflict. The boy king came, but kept his army blocking any access for his sister wife. In the house of Ptolemy, it was usually the women who were the more ruthless, ingenious, and successful of the family. Cleopatra marked her true emergence on the stage of world affairs in dramatic fashion. Evading her brother's blockade, she smuggled herself into the royal enclosure rolled up in a carpet bag, or rug in some tellings. Caesar was both surprised and delighted with her daring. We can't help but imagine Caesar seeing in this brave and reckless gamble the same spirit that he himself possessed. Moreover, here was a young woman, a queen, descended of a general who rode with Alexander, and the ruler of a land ancient beyond compare. It is no wonder, then, that the two slept together that very night. Cleopatra was no Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in the world, but as Plutarch writes, her sex appeal, together with the charm of her conversation, and the charisma evident in everything she said or did, made her, quite simply, irresistible. For all his life, Caesar was infamous as a womanizer. His soldiers sung bawdy songs about his carnal conquests. For Cleopatra, she was locked in a life and death struggle with her brother, and, betting the man who had just proven himself the most powerful in the known world, was a good way of securing her throne. When the young King Ptolemy discovered his sister wife had become Caesar's mistress, he was enraged and stirred the Alexandrian mob to vengeance. Always ready to riot and cause havoc, the mob besieged the royal enclosure and soon was joined by the king's army. After the glories of Gaul and the Civil War, to be so threatened by eunuchs, a child, and a foreign rabble was painfully embarrassing and humiliating for the great Caesar. After his victory at Pharsalus, he should have been securing Rome's provinces, stamping out the last vestiges of resistance, and setting to right all that was rotten in the Republic. Instead, he languished for months in the royal enclosure of Alexandria, and not even a Roman province. All the while, his enemies continued to regroup in Africa and posed a genuine threat to his authority. After several months of this, with skirmishes and raids, one of which resulted in the great library of Alexandria burning to the ground, he regained control of the harbour. And in March 47 BC, reinforcements arrived and the siege was broken. The young King Ptolemy drowned in the Nile during flight, thanks to his heavy enamelled armour. Cleopatra was now the undisputed ruler of Egypt, with Caesar as her protector. For decades, Pompey Magnus had bestrode the East like Jupiter, making and unmaking kings and dynasties at his pleasure. But Caesar always had to go one step further than his old friend and rival. He impregnated the Queen of Egypt. In time, she would give birth to a son, Ptolemy XV Caesar, known to history as Caesarion. He would one day become the last pharaoh of Egypt. The son of Caesar was the last of the monarchs, which tradition dated back to Narmer, 3,000 years before. It is a strange quirk of history that the son of Caesar, whose very name would come to mean kingship and divine rule, would be the last of this venerable title and ancient inheritance. Caesar's dalliance in Egypt with his beguiling young mistress proved a great distraction. For a man whose life had been a constant strain of war, politics, and tribulations, with barely a moment's rest for decades, the heady pleasures of Egypt must have been both a welcome release and a dangerous interference. For months, he stayed by the side of Cleopatra as her belly grew with their child. From Alexandria, they journeyed south on the magnificent royal barge through the native lands of the Egyptians. Caesar visited the ancient sites and monuments of the glorious, long faded past of Egypt's power. It wouldn't be a surprise if, in these monuments to Egypt's past glory, Caesar saw a glimpse into Rome's own future. We must remember that we are closer in time to that of Caesar and Cleopatra than they were to the first kings of Upper and Lower Egypt and the great pyramid builders. Ancient historians say that the couple intended to sail all the way south into Ethiopia, but the disgruntled murmuring of Roman soldiers forbade it. Later in life, Cleopatra would be painted by Roman propagandists as a witch or demon, and we can see why this had such resonance. Because Caesar, famous throughout the world for his restless nature and boundless energy, was entranced to her, and seemingly content to while away his days while war and rebellion were fomented throughout the empire and beyond. Eventually, the chaos erupting in Asia forced him into action. Pharnaces of Pontus, the son of Rome's old enemy Mithridates, had wrought havoc and devastation to the provinces, and destroyed the Roman army stationed there. After many months, Caesar bestirred himself to once more go to war. But his Alexandrian interlude must have had a powerful impression on the great man. Always possessing the natural authority of an autocrat, was it in the faded glories of Egypt and Macedon that Caesar began to envision a dynastic future for the Republic? Saviour of mankind, destroyer of the Republic. The upstart king of Pontus, Pharnaces, had caused chaos in the east, but once Caesar entered the field of battle against him, he was utterly destroyed at the Battle of Zela. It was here that Caesar spoke the famous line, "Veni, vidi, vici." I came, I saw, I conquered. This line perfectly illustrates the genius of Caesar and the aura of invincibility around him that he, his army, and his enemies all bought into. After restoring order in the east, he set out for Italy and Rome. It was 1 year since his great victory at Pharsalus. In October of 48 BC, while still out of Rome, Caesar had been made dictator again for a year. He had first taken the office before he had set off to fight Pompey, so he could oversee the elections of magistrates. But now he took it to restore order in the Republic. The heartland of the Republic was not happy. Mark Antony, the Magister Equitum, master of horse, to Caesar's dictator, had proved an unpopular and incompetent civilian governor. Rather than seeing to the governments of Rome, Antony had instead spent his time partying while dressed as Dionysius, debauching himself with a cadre of actresses and mimes, and most infamously attempting to hitch his chariot to 4 lions. Rome and Italy had been seriously destabilized by the failed rebellion of Caelius and Milo. Cicero's old prodigy, Caelius, had cynically joined Caesar's side at the beginning of the war, thinking him the stronger. After fighting well for Caesar in the Spanish campaign, he was unhappy with his rewards, a praetorship. Caelius had always been one of the most ambitious young men in the Republic, famous for his intrigues and scandals. He is one of the best-known figures of the period, thanks to extensive records of letters he exchanged with Cicero. He used Caesar's long absence from the city to agitate for a total forgiveness of all debts and caused riots throughout the city. Forced to flee, He joined up with the renegade exile Milo, the man who had murdered Clodius upon the Appian Way. He had been in exile in Massilia, the traditional place for Roman exiles. When Caesar had taken the city not long before, he had pardoned almost all of the Roman exiles in Massilia, apart from Milo. Their insurrection had failed, and both were killed. The chaos they had wrought was not easy to fix. Caelius symbolized a whole generation, hedonistic, intelligent, ambitious, and cynical. The actions of Caelius illustrate the treacherous sands that Caesar's power was based upon. He was forced to rely upon cynical, fickle, and ambitious men like this. While Caesar himself was certainly a cynical and ambitious politician in his own right, he was not fickle as Caelius was. He had always been champion of the popularis cause, and he had always been generous and loyal to his friends, and generally treated his enemies with dignity and mercy. Most seriously of all, some of Caesar's most loyal legions, growing disaffected and dissolute in Italy, had mutinied. The 9th and 10th had been with him since the very beginning, but now they rose up in anger. Antony singularly failed to suppress the mutiny. Caesar had not been in Rome long when, astonishingly, the legions began to march upon the city. Against all of the council of his officers and fellow senators, Caesar went in person to meet the mutineers. He rode silently and without ceremony into the camp outside Rome and spoke to them from the podium outside the headquarters. The soldiers clamoured for the redress of their grievances, to get what was owed them, and to be discharged from military service. It must have come as a terrible shock and damaging blow to Caesar. His men, who had performed such feats of heroism, bravery, and daring for the love they bore him, should now betray that love. It was surely a far greater blow emotionally than any senatorial plot or treachery. But Caesar saved the situation by demonstrating why he is one of the greatest leaders of men in all of history. He understood perfectly the psychology of the men who followed him with white-hot precision. After the soldiers' demands had been made, he simply replied, "Quirites, citizens," and told them that they were dismissed and would receive what was their due. For all their long campaigns together, he had called them his comrades. Now, with this one word change, he rebuked them and questioned their honour, their loyalty, and everything they had stood for. They were no longer the comrades, the brothers in arms of the great Caesar. They were no longer bound to his immortal destiny. The soldiers were totally stunned. First individuals, then units, then whole legions begged him to take them back into his service. After much demurring, he eventually agreed, saying that he would take them all save the 10th Legion. Caesar had consistently shown the 10th the greatest favour and honour, such as before they had fought King Ariovistus all the way back at the start of the Gallic conquests. This betrayal was a dagger in his heart. So distraught were the men of the legion to lose Caesar's favour and his love that they pleaded with him to decimate them if only he would take them with him. The ancient punishment of decimation involved every 10th man in the legion being beaten to death by his comrades, a terrible and horrifying punishment that had long fallen out of practice. Crassus had used it during the Spartacus uprising, but it was still incredibly rare and the ultimate humiliation for a Roman legion. Caesar reluctantly agreed to take the 10th without any executions. It was a masterful display of leadership and authority in the face of very real danger. Plenty of Roman commanders and officers had been brutally attacked or murdered by their own mutinous men, especially during times of civil war. Some of his own officers had been attacked by these very same men. Now, with one change of word, he had thousands of angry, battle-hardened killers begging for his forgiveness and his love. The mutiny had been put down with no violence. However, he made note of the ringleaders and was sure to place them in the most dangerous places on the front line of the coming battles. The Africa campaign was the last of the civil wars and saw the destruction of the Optimate cause. In a career of terrifying, close-run wars, the Africa campaign was almost one too many for Caesar. But faced with disaster, he found a way to ultimate victory. At the Battle of Thapsus, Caesar destroyed a combined host of Romans and Numidians under the command of King Juba, Metellus Scipio, and Caesar's old lieutenant Labienus. Unlike the previous battles of the Civil War, Caesar's soldiers killed with reckless abandon their fellow countrymen, no longer restrained by the common ties of citizenship. Over 10,000 men died, for no less than 50 casualties in Caesar's own army. Many men in the legions had grown annoyed at Caesar's policy of clemency, as they ended up fighting the same men over and over again. This time, they would not give him the chance to pardon his defeated foes, instead slaughtering them in an orgy of bloodletting. Even Caesar's merciful inclinations had been dulled by the repeated resistance of his stubborn enemies. Not long after, the city of Utica fell, and Cato, the greatest and most determined of Caesar's foes, committed suicide in a particularly gruesome fashion. Having failed to kill himself with the sword after an evening of discussing philosophy and poetry, he pulled the stitching apart and pulled out his own entrails and intestines. It was a fittingly dreadful and yet heroic end for the figurehead and spiritual champion of the Optimate faction. Caesar was furious. He had not had the opportunity to pardon Cato, and that Cato's bloody end made him a martyr for the cause. But the civil war was over, and some rebels still remained in Spain under the command of Pompey's two sons, but they could offer no serious threat to Caesar now. He was entirely the master of Rome and the empire. After his victories, all across the east, cities began erecting statues and busts of Caesar, with typically grandiose and dramatic inscriptions. One in particular spoke of Caesar as the saviour of mankind. Such was the custom in the East, where god-kings were the normal form of government. To the Greeks of Asia, Caesar and Pompey before him were monarchs in all but name, and this was far more comfortable and easy for them to understand. But in Rome and the West, things were very different. Now he had defeated all of his enemies and wrestled control over the world. How would he govern Rome? Would he do as all of the Catonian propaganda had said he would, and make himself Rex Romanum? All of Rome held its breath.